And now I have the pleasure of introducing Janet Sherlund. Janet is a graduate of Colgate University. She raised her family and served on nonprofit boards in education, health, and the cultural arts before writing her first book and memoir, Abandoned at Birth. Her memoir explores loss and grief in adoption and why it takes more than love to survive that trauma. Thanks for being with us tonight, Janet, and for sharing your story.
Thank you for having me. I really welcome the opportunity to speak to this universe of people who are so familiar with adoption. As I was saying when we were speaking earlier, Ty, in talking about my book, so often I'm speaking to people who really don't know anything about adoption. They don't understand it. And a lot of energy goes into trying to explain to them what it feels like to be an adoptee. But I feel like I'm with my people, my clan here tonight, and appreciate all of your interest in my story. I'm an adoptee, was adopted at birth in the baby scoop era in a closed adoption. And that is the most significant event of my life. I think everything about me was affected by that fact, from my identity, my behavior, but every day of my life was affected by having been adopted at birth, and the feeling of having been abandoned, the feeling of otherness, of disconnect, of not having any information about myself and not being able to form a sense of self. And I thought about being adopted every day of my life. Every day that I can remember being conscious, I wondered who my birth mother was and why I was put up for adoption and what my ethnicity was and where I got my blue eyes and my pug nose. And I'm not sure why it was so profound for me, but I was just wired this way. And it was, and probably remains to this day, one of the most significant factor of my life. I wrote my memoir. Actually, I wanted to write a book about and try to communicate to people what it felt like to be adopted, not just a story about it, not just these are the facts or this is the mystery of my search and reunion, but really try and nail the feelings, not only to affirm for adoptees what our experience was, but to try and give some emotional intelligence about on the issue to people who aren't adopted, to have them be able to read something and go, oh, I feel that. Okay, I see what you're saying now. And so that, and when I first started to write, I was just going to write some vignettes, some sort of like little poetic vignettes, trying to capture that, these lonely, disconnected, dark black hole feelings and string them together and hope people would get it. And early on, a literary agent retired friend who I spoke with said, no, we need to know more about you and go on this journey with you. We need you to write about your life and write a memoir. And I cried. And I cried because I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to relive my childhood and really go back and relive all those emotions and feelings and moments in order to best capture them in my book. But I realized that she was right. I would have to do that. And so I set about writing my memoir. And as we talk tonight and I share my journey with you, I'd like to read some edited selections from my book and to try and illustrate some of the things that I hope to capture in my book. And the first selection I'd like to read is just trying to explain to people what being adopted felt like to me. Who am I? What am I? These questions are the strongest memory I had of my childhood. I was a mystery, a person unknown, and it frightened me. I couldn't see my reflection without wondering who I looked like and where I came from. I yearned to hear someone say, oh, you look just like your grandmother, or you have so-and-so's nose. Anything for a connection to someone real, for an explanation of my existence, how I came to be. My recollections of childhood are ones of feeling disconnected and confused. I was simply there, in a red brick house on a quiet street, in a family where no one shared blood. All my siblings were adopted too. We sat at the dining table between the mahogany sideboard and matching break front a family more carelessly assembled than the dinner menu. My brother Eric, 18 months older than me, was restless and impatient. Mark, 18 months younger, was quiet and nervous. Susie, 7 years younger, watched us all with suspicious eyes. Even as a child, I understood the adoption process. It was part of our bedtime story. Once the agency decided where an infant would be placed, the adoptive parents received a call to come and get the baby. The agency my parents used presented the adoptee to their new parents in an antique cradle with a tall bonnet top. It sat behind ornate pocket doors, which opened with a flourish. I sensed the serendipity of my life. It was so capricious. Nothing about me was solid or sure. Had my name been farther up or down the list, I'd have different parents and siblings and a different name. I might be in a worse family or a better one. But I was here, among this family. Who were they? Who was I? No one looked or moved like anyone else. We didn't share likes or dislikes, strengths or weaknesses. We participated with each other, but didn't belong to each other. There was a disconnect around the table, and you could feel it in the air. Separate force fields surrounded each of us. We were all built from different DNA. Molecules were not shared, and each of us sat in our own genetic dust. It was primal and palpable. I wondered where all these people came from as my eyes roamed around the table. Where did I come from? I was from stardust or sparks, from vapor or a thunderclap. I was quicksilver. It was as if I'd been floating on the wind to light on this family. I had borrowed their identity and name, been taught their interests, and felt the falsehood of that every day. I would stare at myself in the mirror as the questions repeated. Who am I? What am I? The endless, unanswered taunts hovered overhead and crashed down on me, looping through my brain until I had a visceral reaction, a jolt of fear, aloneness, and total detachment. I would no longer recognize my reflection and was shocked and scared by how untethered I felt from everything around me. My stomach jumped, a chill spread through me, my heart raced. I felt profoundly alone. I was aware of everyone else in the house and could hear where they were and what they were doing. But I felt like I was a million miles away, and they didn't know I was missing. I think one of the things that was so shocking to me as I went through my life and then later search and reunion was the physicalness of the disconnect, the physicalness of your reaction to adoption and you're living with it and you're understanding it. There was so much that we didn't have words for and we don't talk about as human beings. We maybe talk about seeing animals and just knowing each other, recognizing each other, but we don't. There was so much of what I experienced was nonverbal and just were things I felt. I didn't have words for them, but I felt them throughout my life. And because I felt this constant sense of disconnect and otherness and sadness, even though I had a lovely adoptive home. I mean, nothing bad was happening to me. I had my siblings, great parents. We had a lovely home. Everything looked perfect, and I should have felt fine, but I didn't. And so I felt, of course, like most children in that situation, that I was crazy. There was something wrong with me. I'm looking around saying, everyone else seems fine. What's wrong with me? Why aren't I happy? And why do I feel so scared and so unsafe? And I went through my childhood like that. And it created two major issues for me that really marred my life. And one was that I stayed very dependent on my adoptive parents. I had very, very profound separation anxiety way too late in life. But one of my reactions to being adopted was, okay, I better be grateful that this family took me in because my birth mother didn't want me and she just gave me up. And so I want to make sure this family wants me. I had one of those classic adoption reactions where I was going to be the perfect child and not give them any reasons not to want me, not to keep me. There were four adoptees in my family, and we split down the middle. two of my siblings were hellions, pushing the boundaries, testing the waters. Would this family still keep us? And two of us were the well-behaved, perfect adoptees. I learned to, do everything my parents valued. I learned to make myself over in their shadows. I didn't feel free to ever express myself, to show honest emotions. I just wanted to be the perfect child. And again, they thought I was, and the wider world thought I was. And to this day, when I hear people say, for example, oh, I know a family with both adopted and biological children, and the adopted kids are the good kids. And I say, red flag. I think the more perfect and the better that an adopted child is, I worry about them more because they really are scared and they really don't feel free. And that's not a healthy way to be for anyone. I also developed horrible panic attacks. I mean, I had major, like, psychedelic panic attacks growing up, starting around 12. And that, I think I lived in this chronic state of anxiety, this chronic state of disconnect and otherness, and so insecure. And so I was both very dependent on my adoptive parents, and I had these horrible panic attacks. And so I didn't have a lot of freedom of choice. There were opportunities or options that, you might take as you're growing up that I didn't because I was afraid of, and yet in pushing myself to my limits to try and still be the perfect child, I would put myself through hell to accomplish things that I knew I was expected to do and suffer the consequences of these horrible panic attacks rather than admit to my weaknesses and perhaps disapproval. So it was just, it was a really rough life of pretending to be fine and suffering because I wasn't fine. And no one knew. I don't think my parents fully knew. They knew I was having panic attacks. They didn't know why. The wider world didn't see that at all. And it was an exhausting way to be. And it wasn't an honest way to be. I wasn't expressing anger, or I wasn't expressing things that I also was very different from my adopted mother, who was a mathematician, and I was an artist, and so we had a very different personality, and I wasn't free to develop this the other sides of me, or fully the sides of me. I wish I had. No, it wasn't until the 1990s, of course, that Nancy Newton Barrier wrote The Primal Wound, which, when I finally read that as a young adult, I was, I sort of finally felt heard and seen and found. These are the words I quoted them in my book because I just wish I had known them. She explains that when adoptees are deprived of knowledge or context for their preconscious sense of loss, they often feel abnormal, sick, or crazy for having those feelings, and are often left confused by their own behavior. She writes, what the child has missed is the security and serenity of oneness with the person who gave birth to him, continuing of bonding from prenatal to postnatal life. This is the profound connection for which the adoptee forever yearns. It is this yearning which leaves him often feeling hopeless, helpless, empty, and alone. That period immediately after birth, when the infant has made the transition from the security of the womb to the cold, bright, alien world of postnatal life, is a crucial period. It is a time when a baby needs to be in proximity to his mother in order to find the world safe and welcoming. At that time, the mother is the whole world for the baby, and his connection to her is essential to his sense of well-being and wholeness. Abandonment is a kind of death, not only of the mother, but of part of the self, that core being or essence of oneself, which makes one feel whole. I was so relieved to read things like that and sort of understand that, first of all, that talking about not being able to form that core of myself and not to feel that strength in me that was in me, I just couldn't feel it. I couldn't get my hands on it. And so I feel, especially now looking back on my life, that I just wasted so many years. I wasted so many years feeling weak and scared, and I'm not weak and I am brave, but I didn't know that. I couldn't see it. I couldn't find it. I just felt so lost. Um, when I went off to college and I was taking a class and stumbled into early childhood development, started reading about how smart infants are, and that led me to finding some studies on adoption. I was so relieved to find that I wasn't alone, that my experience was so universal among adoptees, and there were actually people out there studying it and writing things about it. Again, this is the 1970s now. There wasn't a lot out there yet, but what there was just, I was so grateful for it. And at that time, I was really getting more serious about search. I had always wanted to search. Every day of my life, I wanted to know who my birth mother was, but I didn't want to upset my adoptive parents. And even in college, with that now, more separation, I wasn't living at home all the time. I was away at school. I still was, well, I didn't have anything to search with. I was a closed adoption. I had absolutely no information. So I don't know what I thought I would have searched with. But the thing most holding me back was I didn't want to upset mom and dad. And they told me that they were fine with my searching. They suggested, oh, you could always search. But it's another one of these sort of intuitive things that we feel. I know they didn't mean it. I know my mother didn't mean it. She wanted to say the right thing and she wanted to support me. But I got the message that, well, I'll be really hurt and threatened and scared if you do. But she said the right thing. But again, there's so many messages we pick up that are just chemical, intuitive, just, you just know somebody from living with them, I guess. And so I didn't, but I did do a class at Colgate. I asked, petitioned the university and did an independent study on identity and adoption my senior year. They were happy to do so. I got an A+ on my final paper, and I felt like that gave me some validity. And I was now going to take that paper and send it to my adoption agency and say, okay, would you please tell me anything you can tell me, any non-identifying information you can tell me. And I couldn't do that on my own without this external validity. Like, I didn't want to be just some crazy needy adoptee. I wanted to say, look, I've studied this and I got an A+ in it. And I'm kind of like, I'm more like one of you now. Please, like, tell me whatever you can about myself. And they did send a letter back, and they did give me some information, non-identifying information, much of which I found out later was a false narrative. Things like your birth parents were from a distant state. They were from an hour and a half away from my house, right over the state line. They weren't from a distant state. They talked about, oh, your mother was lovely and so mature for her age and doing this in your best interest. When many years later, I got to read the actual birth records, they did not talk nicely about her at all. She was not. And so they suggested occupations they had. And so my whole life, from right after college up until my 50s, I had this very false narrative about who my birth parents were, where they lived. I would imagine them living. They did tell me they were Irish, so I was trying to think of places, the big Irish population, Chicago, maybe Boston, where might they live? And this is what they were like. And oh, I was sure my birth mother wanted to meet me. She sounded so lovely and so together. And yeah, none of that was true. So it wasn't until, now flash forward. So I go through life, I get married, I have children, and I do feel that, like many of us do, now my children's medical records, I'm writing unknown, adopted, when they ask for the family history. And I was feeling even more sorry that I didn't have any information about my own life to pass along now to my children. And so one day I'm in my 50s and I'm talking to my adopted mother on the phone, and I say, whatever happened to our adoption agency? I was sure it had, been closed years before. And she said, oh no, they're still around and they even have a website. So I Googled it while I'm on the phone, and I noticed this little button on the side that says search. I'm like, oh my God. So I click it, and lo and behold, some years after they had written to me back in college, they started search and reunions. And if both the adoptee and the birth parent agreed, and of course they had all the information, they knew who the birth parents were, they would facilitate a meeting and unite you. So I was thrilled. I was sure this mature, wonderful birth mother of mine would be just, if she was alive still, would love to meet me. So I filled out my application, sent it in, waited the 9 months that it took for them to get to my name on the list. There were so many adoptees using this service. And they had me in for an interview to make sure I wasn't crazy, I guess. And then they said, well, we'll see if we can find her. And they did. They found her in like really quick. And they called to say, we found her. She's alive. And I was, oh my God. I've been thinking about this woman for like, I think it was 56 years at the time. This is great. I'm going to meet my birth mother. I said, so write a letter telling us what your life's been like, why you want to meet her, send some pictures of yourself, child, young, middle, currently, and then we'll send it to her and then we'll see if she'll meet you. So anyway, I do all that. It passes muster with the agency. I'm waiting and I'm like, this is great. I shared pictures of myself. I told her my story. I couldn't wait. And then I get the phone call back that she doesn't want to meet me. And they said, nope, she doesn't want to remember that time in her life. She's embarrassed by it. She won't meet you. And but she doesn't live in her hometown anymore. She hasn't lived there apparently since I was born, before I was born. She works outside the home. I mean, we could meet for coffee. Like no one has to know. She was on her second marriage. She wasn't even married. I mean, it didn't make sense to me. And they said, no, she's embarrassed by it. And she doesn't want to meet you. And this is what I wrote when that happened. With her outright rejection, something in me broke. I curled into the deep cushions in the family room and pulled a blanket over myself. The fireplace was lit. The room smelled of raw wood and smoke, and television saturated the room with an electronic drone. I have no memory of leaving the sofa for a very long time. Weeks, maybe a month. I stared out the window at the dulling season. The sky went gray, the woods turned hard, and the grass browned. At some point, my husband and sons moved in and out of the background as the Christmas tree went up and the lights were strung, the multicolored ones that reminded me of my childhood Christmases. They hung the hundreds of ornaments I'd collected, but to no effect. Snow fell, drifting in slow motion past the window as I sat empty, confused, and helpless. I didn't cry, though I was devastated. I felt I might suffocate, that this blow could extinguish me. In those moments, defending myself against that awful feeling, I told myself I shouldn't take this so hard. I was a grown 56-year-old woman. But I couldn't protect myself against emotions I didn't understand. I was feeling something deeper and more profound than I knew, something somatic, preverbal, and unconscious. It was something from deep down in a place I didn't have words for, a trauma from before I had language, from a time when terror could only be expressed in a wailing and shrieks and gulping sobs alone in a crib. Flailing arms, a red face, a burning throat of fear from having been abandoned. For 9 months, I heard my mother's voice, felt her rhythms, and tasted her. We were bonded physically and emotionally. I came from that woman's body. I shared her DNA. I had been one with her until suddenly I was not. When those bonds were severed, there was a profound loss. I was crying in a nursery, and I was alone. Now I felt like I'd been abandoned again. The primal wound had not healed. So it was a much more profound rejection than I would have ever imagined when she refused to meet me. And she continued to refuse to meet me for 5 years after that. The agency was shocked. It's so rare that a birth mother, no matter what the circumstances of the conception were, didn't want to meet their grown adult child they'd given up. But mine was one of the rare ones. So they told me, gee, we have your birth father's name. Would you like to meet him? And that was rare for the 1950s to have the father's name at all. They didn't have any rights. They didn't sign anything. And I knew that he didn't know I existed. He didn't know that he had fathered a child at age 18. And I thought, I don't know. I've never really thought about my birth father. I've always wondered about my birth mother. But, maybe I could get some medical information and sure, go ahead, have at it. I really very reluctantly. And so they did. They found him very easily. He actually still lived in the same town where he had grown up and my birth mother had grown up. They had gone to high school together. And so they called and they said, well, the first phone call, they got him during Jeopardy one night. He was 75 years old, retired New York State trooper. And he's home and they called him and told him, you have a daughter and she'd like to meet you. And he said, call me tomorrow night. And he wanted to make sure it was a legitimate phone call. So he checked that out. When they called the next night he said, if she has my blood, she's my daughter. Of course, I want to meet her. So now I went, we arranged to meet and we were going to meet halfway between my home and his home. My husband was going to come with me and two of my half siblings and one of their spouses were going to go with him. And we were going to meet. And I realized how terrified I was. I knew nothing about him. I had gotten his name and I'd Googled him and nothing came up. Now, this was back in 2010, actually early 2011. And I didn't know anything about law enforcement at the time. I didn't realize that a lot of law enforcement do not have online profiles, but I just thought, oh my God, nothing comes up on this man. I don't know, who is he? What is he? This is gonna be, I was terrified. So we drove up to this halfway point and to meet at this ski resort, actually, that was halfway between our homes. And this is how that went. When we arrived at the resort, my rubbery legs barely crossed the parking lot into the lobby. The building was larger than I'd imagined, and I had no idea where the restaurant was or how Larry and I would recognize each other. I should have suggested something, flowers pinned to our lapels or a particular colored shirt. Sweat pricked across my brow and down my spine. I pulled off my heavy coat and clutched it like a life preserver. Discouraged and confused, I withdrew, while Rick, that's my husband, remained on high alert. He scanned the area and spied an older man on a bench across the lobby. When they locked eyes, he knew immediately it was Larry. Rick didn't say a thing as the man stood and walked towards us. I was looking the other way and still oblivious. Suddenly, someone was standing in front of me, and I felt his hands fold over mine, saw his face lean close, a face that was wide and open with bright blue eyes. He held on firmly, looked directly into my eyes and said, "You're Janet." I wasn't prepared for the connection, to see myself in his eyes, his face. I wasn't prepared for the lifelong hole in my gut to slam shut the moment he took my hands in his, smiled, and said those two simple words, "You're Janet." I was found. I looked into my father's eyes, and I finally made sense. And it was so amazing to me. Again, there was so much that you couldn't put words to, so much like just chemical, cellular, physical that was happening. I couldn't have answered two questions about this man. And yet I looked into his eyes and that big black hole in me filled right up. I mean, how do you explain that? It's crazy. But it was like, I'm back with I've been wandering in the desert alone for hundreds of years, and now I find my people. And then my half brother and sister, they insist on just being called brother and sister, were there too. And we were all in tears and we just were so comfortable with each other. And we moved to a table and we sat there for hours and it just felt so good. It felt so natural. And we were laughing and talking and Larry Patrick Rogan, my birth father, and I were we couldn't take our eyes off each other. He said that I looked just like my birth mother and it made him feel 18 again. One of the things I'll never forget is he had his high school yearbook with him and he had a name tag on top that they had used at a recent high school reunion of his senior class picture. And when I looked down at it, I was like, I was looking at my older son. I mean, he was the spitting image of my father, but we never knew who my older son looked like. And it turned out he looked like his grandfather, but we never knew that before that day. Um, and I will say there's something really wonderful about meeting a parent in midlife because there's no baggage. So he could just love me and I could just love him and we could just want to learn everything about each other. And there was none of that, all those old resentments and all the work of raising a child. You just meeting each other and you're just open and you're receptive and you're excited and you're curious. And it's very pure love and joy. And that's really what that whole experience was like and remain. I still have my brother and sister and their families come to Nantucket every summer and we talk all the time. And it was just truly wonderful. And that moment and that experience gave me so much more of a solid sense of self. Again, that black hole just filled in, and I suddenly started seeing myself in my father, in my brother, in my sister. Things just started clicking and making sense. Like, oh, that's why I look. Oh, that's how I do. I get that from there. Oh my gosh, look at that. Things about myself that I never liked. I didn't like my stubby fingers or my pug nose, and I saw them in this family, and I was like, oh, I couldn't look any other way. I'm one of them. I mean, this is who I am. It was such a relief to know why I was like I was, even why I looked like I did. It just gave me a heritage and a connection to this world and people who were like me. And even if I didn't really know them, I understood them. I understood decisions they made and choices that it was amazing. Um, so of course, he told me who my birth mother was, and he had pictures of her, and I saw them together. They had dated for 2 years in high school. So I found her, and I kept reaching out to her about once a year to see if she'd changed her mind. Like I would say, I know who you are now. I met Larry. I know who you are. I'd like to meet you. Um, and sadly, 2 years after meeting him, my birth father died. He had he was riddled with cancer, and we found that out very suddenly, and he died within 3 weeks of finding that out, and that was another devastation to me because I had just found him, and now I lost him again. And after that, I really even more wanted to meet my birth mother, and so I kept trying. The social worker at my agency suggested I reach out to my 5 half siblings and her side, that they had the right to know I existed and they had the right to decide if they wanted a relationship with me or not. I kept putting that off, and I kept saying it was because, well, she doesn't want to meet me. I don't want to blow up that family. And they're probably, if she's not very nice, maybe they won't be nice. Maybe they'll see me as an interloper. And what really a big part of it was that it's hard to admit, I was in my 50s. I didn't want her to be mad at me. I so wanted her to like me and want me that I didn't want to like blow up her family by outing her to her family and reaching out to them first. But I finally got mad enough to do so. So 5 years after she first refused me, I was reading Joan Didion's Blue Nights, and something she said in there about her adopted daughter's birth really annoyed me. So I wrote a letter to all 5 siblings and sent it overnight to all of them, and didn't know if I'd hear from anybody. The very next day, I had a phone call, and I picked up the phone, and this woman said, "Hello, Janet. This is your sister, Diane." And she was crying, and all 5 of my siblings embraced me and welcomed me and told me that I was lucky not to have been raised by her mother, that she was not very kind and she's sort of all business and hadn't been a great mother to them. But as I'm sure all of you know, that I still wanted to meet her. I still wanted to know her. And it was, we did finally meet, and because of them, and they pressed her to do so and sort of forced her hand, and we did meet, but it was awkward and uncomfortable. And she didn't want, the first thing she said to me was, "I don't know who you look like. You don't look like anybody in my family." When in fact, everyone in her family had been telling me how much I looked like her and Larry. And it was just painful. She was just rejecting me to my face and denying me. I felt like saying, "Oh, I am your family. I'm your firstborn child," but I didn't have the guts to say that. But again, one of the confusing things, I mean, I understand it with Larry. He was wonderful and we had this great connection. The confusing thing about my reunion with Shirley, my birth mother, is that she couldn't emotionally accept me. And yet, whenever I was around her, I felt so at home. It was such a confusion. Or whenever I was around my siblings, I again felt that same feeling of family and connection. It was like cells must recognize each other. This is so weird. I mean, I just don't know why I feel so comfortable with everyone. Especially, why do I feel so comfortable around this woman who's just keeping me jammed and just jamming me? But so this is what I wrote about the second time I met my mother, when I didn't just have lunch alone with her. I went with one of my sisters, and that really helped. We settled into a polished mahogany booth, and Diane and Shirley fell into conversation about Diane's kids and work. I listened and joined in occasionally, and there were moments that felt so familiar, I had to remind myself we hadn't been doing this all our lives. My cells were entirely at ease. Despite Shirley's reluctance to claim me, my body had found its home. We shared DNA, and this feeling wasn't a choice. It was an innate belonging of blood, molecules, and memory. It was staggering and irrefutable. And I wondered what would have been like to have had this feeling of connection and affirmation all of my life. I am who I am, quiet and calm, because it's how I was made. Two of my adopted siblings, Eric and Susie, teased me for being too reserved and proper, which made me feel something was wrong with me. Watching myself with Shirley and Diane, I saw our shared demeanor, which Carol and my new nephews commented on the first time we met. Shirley and I also had similar tastes and were both collectors. It would have been wonderful to share that. My adopted mother, Audrey, was practical and always chose function over form, making my love of decorating, art, fashion, and garden seem frivolous. What a surprise to learn it wasn't frivolity. It was my DNA. And that confusion lasted throughout my relationship with Shirley. It was like I felt so familiar and relaxed around her physically, but she just couldn't accept me emotionally. And that was painful. And some people ask me, they say, well, I don't want to search and find something upsetting or find something unpleasant like that, or a rejection again. And my response to that is, you don't really know yourself until you know all of yourself. You don't get in a biological family to decide whether everyone in the family is nice, or everyone's kind, or everyone likes you, or everyone has, doesn't have a problem and alcoholism or drug, whatever. You take what you get and you deal with it. And all of that makes you who you are. I am so glad that I met my birth mother, despite the difficulty of that, because I did see myself in her. I did learn so much about myself by looking at her and seeing her physically, certainly meeting all my siblings, but she was also a good cautionary tale. I mean, there are traits that I had that I saw in her that I didn't like at all. But whenever I experienced them in myself, I could just dismiss them. Like, oh, I'm just in a mood today or something. But when I saw that her, I went, whoa, okay, that's in my DNA. Don't let that take over, because that's not pretty. And so it was really helpful to meet the negative as well as the positive. I don't think you can be a complete human being unless you know the full picture. And so I was very grateful that I met her, even though it wasn't sort of a happy ending. And so now I'd met my biological father, my biological mother, and I thought the work was done. But now I had to integrate it all, because now I had the adoptive me and the biological me, and how did those fit together, and where do they intersect, and it was a lot more work than I expected. And but I got through it. I did have therapy. Not only read every book I could always get my hands on adoption, but I did see a therapist. I did have lots of therapy, and that really helped. And it really helped put myself together. And when after both my adoptive parents passed away, I was cleaning out their house one day, and it was that day when I just lost both of them now too. But I realized what had happened, the work that I'd been doing in therapy and just in processing these reunions, and um, I had this experience going into their house to continue cleaning it out one day. I arrived as always with dread and determination and dragged myself up the front walk. But that morning, standing among the disheveled moving boxes, something changed. As the early light of spring gathered in the room, a sense of strength rose in me. I actually felt it rise from my legs, up my back, across my shoulders to the top of my head. The furnishings appeared to shrink until I felt as if I was standing in a child's playhouse. Unnerved, I stepped outside to take a break. The scent of new grass and damp wood filled the April morning. Dew clung to everything, and sunlight poked through the trees to touch the starting wood ferns. A breeze moved across my skin, and I lifted my face to the sky. Inhaling deeply, I felt the breath spread from my very center, filling every inch of me. It felt solid right down through my feet, their weight pressing into the soft, wet lawn. A shift had taken place over the months of grieving and packing. I had grown stronger. I'd been freed from the mystery of who I was and the boundaries of who I was raised to be. As I took apart my childhood home, there was no more uncertainty. I discovered how I connected to the world and experienced a physical sense of belonging when I found my blood family. Finding my origins showed me why I look, think, and act as I do. It also helped me understand the depth of the primal wound I endured and how necessary it is to acknowledge the trauma of separation. Without facing the grief of abandonment and loss of identity, adoptees remain the adopted child forever, deeply affected and living a borrowed life. I had my full life to live now. It was time to be me, all of me. It hadn't been easy to integrate the adopted me and the biological me. But as I learned to accept all that made me, all I was given, and all I survived, I found love and forgiveness, especially for myself, and felt more authentic than I ever had. And just, of course, life doesn't wrap up that in a bow like that. And I just want to leave you with my thoughts when eventually a couple years later, my birth mother then died. Shirley died. So now I lost Larry and both my adopted parents and now Shirley. And I thought at the time when she died, I thought I had come to terms with her, that I wasn't expecting anything more from her and I could live with that. And I just would be fine with my relationship with my siblings. But life isn't that neat. When Shirley passed sooner than anyone thought she would, it hurt more than I ever imagined it could. Maybe my resolve was not as complete as I thought. I was protecting myself in the present, but in fact, still hoped for a future. And despite forewarning, I was stunned when Diane called to tell me the news. The woman I'd searched for all my life was gone. I was okay until the day before her funeral, when I became unrelentingly weepy. I fought back tears at the airport, on my flight, and at the hotel. I was grieving the mother I barely knew, who did not want me in her life, but still I was indeed grieving my mother. The wound at my center was opening again. Before the service began, I was handed a white gift bag that held a small plastic box with some of Shirley's ashes. She wanted her ashes scattered in Ireland, and since I was planning to be there within the year for my son Ben's wedding, I could take them. The daughter she didn't want was going to return her to a place she loved. I decided she'd be uncomfortable with that plan and held the bag apologetically. When we finally stood, after the ceremony, I moved to the side, away from the others, and watched siblings approach the fresh dirt and said goodbye to their mother. Nephews and their wives huddled together instinctively, organically, the younger generation. They all had memories to recall, familiar humor to lighten the moment. I didn't know any of their family history, and at that moment didn't feel any part of this family. Yet I physically felt a piece of my center had been removed and buried beneath that fresh earth, lost in the grave with Shirley. I stood at the crest of the hill, holding the white paper bag in front of me like an awkward child. Bright fields rolled away to leafless trees, and the cold sun stabbed at my glasses. The wind made me wish for a heavier coat. It was impossible to hold back my grief, and I allowed myself to cry quietly. I didn't feel entitled to express more grief than my siblings, but tears flowed under my sunglasses and dripped down my cheeks. There was a profound ache inside of me. I realized this was the story of my life. This was what it was to be adopted. I was not, nor ever would be, truly a part of any of these families. Not my mother's, not my father's, not my adopted family. I was lucky to have the love and support of Rick and the boys, but I lacked a solid foundation. I worked hard to gather the fragments of my life and piece them together. Harder still to process and integrate all that I learned. And it was that work and all I had come to know that strengthened me and held me up as I stood alone on that hill in the cold November sun. That's my story.
Thank you for sharing that, Janet. Beautifully written, absolutely beautiful. There were a few people who had submitted questions, through the registration process. I'd like to invite those of you that are here that had a question even before the talk, if you'd like to ask that, you can do that now. Or if you'd like, and I can also ask it if you'd prefer.
Can I jump in with a question?
You sure can. I was hoping you would.
I don't know, Janet, if you thought of this as when you were going into writing this book, but when you write a book like this and adoptees are going to read it, that it's almost like a how-to book where, we look to these kinds of books, or I know I do, and thinking, oh, should I continue further with my search? Or, I had a one and done conversation with my birth mother last year, also at the age of 56.
Wow.
Should I push forward with that, or let it lie? And that last paragraph, which you just read of the book from the epilogue, was something that really struck me, because there's a bit of resignation in that, that no matter how hard you work at reunion and all the connections that you can make, there's still going to be that disconnect with your biological family, with your adopted family. And it's a little bit of, curse is a strong word, but it's a little bit of the burden of the adoptee that you will, at least I feel for me, that I will always carry. But I did want to point out that I was definitely reading your book with a feeling of like, oh, this is what I should do now. Maybe no, this is a cautionary tale. I should not do this. So not really a question so much, but I just wanted to share that.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think, yeah, that's why I wanted to end there, because that is certainly where I've sort of ended up, is that we never get over the hurt, and we are ultimately alone. But I think you can get stronger to deal with that. Like, I don't think if I hadn't done all this work, done all the readings, met the people, talked about it, been in therapy, I don't think I could have stayed standing at that moment in time at the funeral, when I'd lost the fourth of my four parents between the biological and the adopted. And I think there are hard truths and hard realities of being adopted. And I think the only way to be able to face them and live with them is to get yourself as strong as possible by getting all the information and all the facts, and never taking no for an answer if you want to. I mean, if you're driven to keep searching or keep pursuing a relationship, then do that. And I'd say never stop. I was just driven in these things. I just couldn't not do these things, and so I did. But I know I couldn't have faced all of this and faced it and felt it and been okay with living with it had I not done all this work. So I'd say to everybody, find out everything, and it will make you stronger. It will make you as strong as possible. Let me say that.
Jan had shared something in the chat, which I think a lot of us as adoptees feel, of her expression, if you guys can see it in there. I lived my whole young life in fear and trying to be the perfect child they wanted. I searched and found my whole bio family and never felt like I belonged in that family or in my adopted family either. I still feel like a person going through life alone, even though I have 2 children and grandchildren. Thank you for sharing that, Jan. She's also wondering how long it took you to write your memoir.
I spent 3 years actively writing the book. I had written bits and pieces, like when I met my birth father, I wrote about that then, that was 2011. And so I'd written bits and pieces throughout life, but to actually really sit down and go, I'm going to make a book now out of this, it was 3 years and like, I don't know, 300,000 drafts. And right, as they say, writing is rewriting, but I did it. And I appreciate that comment because it's confusing still, even as an adoptee, and of course, people always want us to just be grateful and happy, but it's odd. And when I first wrote that last paragraph, I did not put anything in there about my husband and sons. I just was saying, I don't belong to my father's family, my mother's, or my adopted family. And that's why I'm alone. And everyone kept saying, well, what about Rick and the boys? And for some reason, I mean, that helps, but some reason that doesn't count. I understand that feeling of, I don't know, because of maybe foundationally, or maybe as I grew up, I didn't have that, and I'm even blood related to my son. So I don't know why, but my instinct was not to include that because it's indeed to count in life as much as not being really a part of any of those other families. So I hear that, and I'm glad to hear someone else say that.
Thank you. Andrea?
Hi, everybody. I'm Andrea. I'm an adopted person. I say adopted person because I feel adoptee. I feel like a little child, and adopted
Yes.
person, I feel a bit older.
I agree.
I've just sobbed, Janet, through what you shared and the way that you've managed to articulate my life, and just all the emotion and the energy that's stored in the body that's non-verbal that you've managed to put onto the page. I just thank you. And I was just going to ask a question about getting married and have children. I haven't been able to get married and have children. That fear of loss is just too great. And so I was going to ask the question that's just been answered about the black hole, and to not be able to fill it, that it needs to be a biological fill, not beyond that. I've met, well, no, I haven't met the biological father, but I met my biological mother once, and there was just I don't feel anything there. I've just found out 3 months ago that my birth father isn't the man I've been looking for 28 years. It's somebody else. It's like, if there's anything, follow the DNA, not the story. But I don't feel that that mirroring, and that I still feel alone. But even though you got all of that, at the end of the day, you were still on your own island at that completion at Shirley's funeral and service. So I think to be able to accept that it is what it is, and I've fought to not be that person, but I am that person that you've described. And so that self-acceptance, and to just let it go instead of fighting all the time. I'm so tired. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And good luck.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing and for your questions. We can do one more. There was a question that was just submitted at the last moment about another interview, Janet, that you'd been part of, where you had said you'd stepped away from the larger adoption community for a little while to listen to your own voice while you were writing. And the question is, will you please speak more on that decision, what you gained from it, and what it was like coming back online in adoption spaces? Well,
I should clarify that I was never part of the online community. Maybe it's my age, I don't know, but I had read, books about it. I really hadn't gone to I really wasn't part of the online community. And I would be more aware of it as I was writing the book, but purposely didn't go there because I didn't want to be influenced by other voices and other opinions and other thoughts, which I find now when I do go there, look, you can get very excited and about someone's point of view or perspective, and really that just stays with me. So I definitely avoided it on purpose during the 3 years that I wrote my book, and now I am back looking and listening and reading, and um, it still is very affirming. I think that I am so proud and excited of the younger, more active adoptees for really speaking out and for really, in some cases, being, very direct. And in some cases, I'd use the word militant about it, but they're making great points and they're talking about it and they're connecting people. And even if I'm just sort of casually scrolling one day and I come across a post and read it, I'm always like, wow, that's great. So I think it's very encouraging that that community is out there and that people can have the experiences affirmed and can be energized to advocate. But it's nothing that I had been in and stepped away from. I didn't join it for a longer period of time while I was writing, and now I'm just learning more about it and so putting my toes in the water.
Great. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat a link to complete a survey. We'd love to hear what you think. Your opinions matter a lot. It helps inform the way we plan our programs going forward. So if you can take a few minutes to share your thoughts, we sure would appreciate it. Also, please join us for our next Monday evening speaker series next week on May 20th with Dr. LaShonda Pittman, who'll be discussing her book, Grandmothering While Black. We're going to take a break for the summer following next week's program, but we will resume this in September. Thanks to everyone who joined us tonight, and thank you, Janet, for sharing so much with us and volunteering your time with us this evening. Adoption Network Cleveland is a nonprofit organization serving individuals and families impacted by adoption, kinship, and foster care through support, education, and advocacy. We're a membership organization, and we hope that everyone will consider joining as a member. To find out more about our organization and to support our work, please visit our website at adoptionnetwork.org. And we hope to see you on one of our many programs. Thank you all for being here this evening.